Hi, everyone. My name is Liz Edmondson. I'm the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy here at CSG, and we're here today for a webinar on pricing rooftop solar. All across the country, state legislators and regulatory commissions are debating the path forward for distributed energy resources, such as rooftop solar. Today, two former regulatory commissioners, Mr. Gary Pierce and Mr. Ashley Brown, will discuss how electricity rates are determined, the impact of policies promoting distributed generation, and how to design public policies to enable the growth of distributed generation while ensuring that electric rates are fair and affordable for all electric customers. Mr. Gary Pierce is the former chairman of the Arizona Corporation Commission. Pierce has a long track record of advocating issues while working both in the private sector and in public service. Most recently, he finished his second four-year term as a commissioner at the Arizona Corporation Commission. Prior to his service there, Pierce was an elected state representative at the Arizona House of Representatives from 2001 to 2006, where he served in such roles as Majority Whip and Chair of the Transportation Committee. In the private sector, Pierce began his career as a teacher, but quickly moved into the auto industry as a sales consultant and manager. He has owned a dealership for Honda, Nissan, and Isuzu, as well as a budget rental car franchise and a Shell service station. Mr. Ashley Brown is the executive director at the Harvard Electric Policy Group and former commissioner of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. Brown leads the Harvard Electricity Policy Group at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. The Harvard Electricity Policy Group provides a forum for the discussion and analysis of electricity issues in the United States. He is of counsel to the law firm of Greenberg Traurig, LLP, and he's also served as an advisor on infrastructure regulatory issues to governments such as Brazil, Tanzania, India, Ukraine, Russia, Philippines, Zambia, Namibia, Argentina, Costa Rica, and Hungary. From 1983 to 1993, Brown served as commissioner of the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, appointed twice by Governor Richard F. Celeste. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Gary Pierce for our first presentation.
Thank you. We'll start off with slide one. I really am delighted to have been asked to participate in this webinar for the Council of State Governments and to once again be on our program with Ashley Brown. I hope that my background and perspective on energy policy will provide a positive contribution to today's discussion. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the great work that elected officials perform at both the legislative level and the Public Utility Commission level in sifting through very difficult policy issues surrounding electric generation. I was a member of the Arizona Corporation Commission, which we call the ACC. In 2007 and 2008, I was a member when the ACC created net metering rules that provided a reimbursement for electrical generation sold back on the distribution grid to utility customers by those with solar panels on their roofs. Next slide. Over time, the utilities made the Commission aware of a cost shift from those with rooftop solar to those who do not have rooftop solar. Interestingly, it is not solar that creates the cost shift, it is rate design. So I've put together the following slideshow entitled Wedge and Sledge, the driving influences behind rate design and the proper valuation of solar net metering to describe this phenomenon. Next slide. The rate making or rate design for what utility company customers will pay for electricity is set by public utility commissions. When it begins, it is really no different than a family sitting down and setting their own household budget. Families must have certain items that are necessities, should have some items that are generally needed, and would like to have a few items that are purely unnecessary. Next slide. In rate making, the monopoly utility by law is allowed a rate of return based on their budget, which includes the value of their assets. Rate of return is always a key arguing point in a rate case. In order to equate the company's revenue requirement, the rate of return must be established. That rate is then multiplied by the company's assets minus accrued depreciation. I know many of you probably thought there wasn't going to be math in this, but there is a little bit. Finally, operating expenses are added to this number to give us the revenue requirement. With that number identified, it is a matter of dividing it by the amount of power expected to be used to get at the basic rate. After that number is established, established policy objectives or social engineering wedges are added that increase the budget, thereby increasing customer rates in a process called rate design. Depending on the hammer a special interest uses to drive the wedge, the increases could be minuscule or very impactful. A family may not have the luxury of increasing its budget, but the Public Utility Commission has no such restrictions on the budget they create for the utility. Therefore, any policy-driven increases or social engineering wedge issues are absorbed by the customers. Next slide. Here is the formula for arriving at rates used by every public utility in every rate case in every state and territory of the United States. That is prior to the adoption of social engineering wedge issues. So just before that happens, you have this rate design. And here's a rate formula. The traditional rate formula is intended to produce a utility's revenue requirement. It goes like this. R equals O plus the sum of V minus D multiplied by lowercase r. Now we'll get into that a little bit. The elements of a traditional rate formula are defined as R is the utility's total revenue requirement or rate level. This is the total amount of money a regulator allows a utility to earn. O is the utility's operating expenses. V is the gross value of the utility's tangible and intangible property. D is the utility's accrued depreciation. Combined, V minus D constitute the utility's rate base, also known as its capital investment. R is the rate of return a utility is allowed to earn on its capital investment or on its rate base. Next slide. I'm going to use a fictitious example to describe this. Prodigious Power is a utility company that has an operating expense of $200,000. Its gross value is determined to be $1.1 million, while its accrued depreciation is $100,000. The rate of return on capital investment will be 10% for this rate case. What will be the total revenue requirement of Prodigious Power? Next slide. So if the utility had operating expense O of $200,000 and its gross value V minus depreciation D equals a rate base of $1 million, the $1 million rate base would be allowed to earn a rate of return, little r, or interest on the investment. If we multiply the capital investment by a 10% rate of return, it totals $100,000. When added to the operating expense, the total revenue requirement is $300,000. If Prodigious Power's total anticipated energy usage by its customers is 3,750,000, I'm sorry, give me the next slide. There we go. So if their anticipated usage is 3,750,000 kilowatt hours, what would be the rate per kilowatt hour? In order to find this, you must divide the total revenue requirement by the anticipated energy usage. So you can see that if the utility's total power usage by its customers is 3,750,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, the rate per kilowatt hour of electricity would be 8 cents. As you can see, it's easier to understand if you understand the definitions and the arithmetic. And I tried to make this so that it's kind of very small utility, very small usage, and make it come out to a flat 8 cents to make this work. As you can see, it is easier once you have that understood. Next slide. Now, next slide. So now we're going to look at this wedge and sledge issue. Back to the theme on budgets. A family sets a base budget, then decides what additional items they want that are not necessities. Each of these items is a wedge, and each wedge, when driven in by a hammer, raises the budget a little. Some of these items could raise the budget in an extreme manner. This would be considered a large wedge. For instance, deciding to buy an airplane or a houseboat would be an extreme wedge in the budget for most families. And it could be very contentious, especially if certain members of the family are not allowed to use the luxury items. A strong-willed or pushy member of the family wielding a large enough sledge to drive the wedge may just end up getting their way. I'm sorry. I think we skipped a slide. Back one. There it is. All right, thanks. Utility commissions are allowed to include wedge issues and add them to rates. Some would consider this added increase to be social engineering, and they are correct. It is social engineering. Policy considerations such as low-income programs are widely accepted as a means to protect the most vulnerable against extreme weather conditions in parts of the United States. That happens here in Arizona. It's going to be over 100 degrees by 1 o'clock here, which is 4 o'clock on the East Coast. So, and I'm sure the East Coast has similar issues in the winter. After the Public Utility Commission performs its legal and necessary requirement according to the formula explained previously, various wedge issues do come into play. Those wedges are varied, and their sponsors often include low-income advocates, as I just mentioned, the State Consumer Advocate in Arizona, they're called RUCO, lobbyists for big box stores like Walmart, lobbyists for mining who use massive amounts of electricity in Arizona to do copper mining. There's reasonable solar lobbyists, and then there's lobbyists for the solar lease finance model. We have the Sierra Club, other organizations, AARP, and like I said, the School Boards Association and so on are all folks who intervene in rate cases and come with their special need. These groups, next slide. These groups and others each try to drive their wedges into the rates. Some drive their wedge with a tack hammer and some with a sledge. All of these wedges, if allowed to go into effect, will raise rates on customers. Some will raise rates on all customers, while others increase rates on a portion of customers of the utility while reducing rates for others. That means some get the advantage of the policy and others get to pay for others to take advantage of the policy. Public safety, those with special needs, conservation, and other socially concerned parties are all at the table in a rate case, and rates are always driven up if the wedge they hammer is included during the Commission's rate-making process. In the past, the Arizona Corporation Commission has allowed a number of special interests to receive favored treatment in the rate design, resulting in higher rates. That is why rates don't sit at 8 cents per kilowatt hour for very long during the rate design portion of a rate case. I hope this information has been helpful in understanding how commissions design rates and the pressure brought to bear by special interest groups and businesses that make a lot of money on subsidies hidden in rate design. Next slide. One of the most insidious subsidies is called solar net metering. Net metering allows solar rooftop owners to sell unneeded power back to the utility. Because net metering is based on the retail rate, which, as you have learned, is often run up due to the wedge and sledge procedures of special interest groups. A local utility, Salt River Project, decided in a recent rate case to fight off the special interest solar leasing companies and their lobbyists. Salt River Project, or SRP, is not regulated by the Arizona Corporation Commission, but has its own publicly elected board of directors. The result was a fair net metering rate with a service charge to reflect the services solar customers were receiving yet not paying for in their former rate design. Next slide. Interestingly, 8 cents per kilowatt hour isn't really the true cost of electrons flowing to your home. In the formula, we simply divided the revenue requirement, R, by its expected usage. That formula actually bundles all the services of the utility into one number. Next slide. In truth, once you take out the large transmission wires, substations, smaller transmission lines, etc., and are left with just the production of the energy, the cost is somewhere between 3 and 5 cents per kilowatt hour. And that is primarily the fuel cost, which is in Arizona coal, natural gas, uranium. Salt River Project acknowledged these facts and designed rates to reflect what is actually occurring on their system. Next slide. The evidence clearly shows that it is unfair to non-solar rooftop homeowners who make up 98% of utility customers to pay any more than 3 to 5 cents in a net metering payment to solar homeowners. Most solar installation companies recognize this unfairness and are adjusting their business plans to be successful with a fair net metering charge. Unfortunately, the biggest profiteer of unfair net metering policy, a company called Solar City, is suing Salt River Project. I am certain SRP and their customers will prevail. Let's talk about some folks with a big wedge and a big sledge. It is unfortunate that Solar City, its public relations firm, and its front groups, TUSC, which is Tell Utilities Solar Won't Be Killed, and TASC, T-A-S-C, the Alliance for Solar Choice, they have adopted scorched earth policy of attacking regulators, utility companies, boards of directors, and anyone who dares examine solar policies that might not be working out for consumers. Indeed, doing the right thing can be hard to do when a media campaign is being waged to stop you. In Arizona, we didn't see this coming. We did not have a crystal ball to show us the consequences of our policy decisions on net metering and the powerful special interest group it created. Other states do have a crystal ball by peering into the painful and ongoing Arizona experience. If you do not agree with these groups, they will attack you, make up stories about you, hire conservative lobbyists to go after conservatives, hire liberal lobbyists to go after liberals, and hire someone in between if that serves their purpose. When you think of wedge and sledge, think about the groups who are doing the most public relations damage in your state to historically trusted individuals and organizations. At the end of the day, it is important for regulators to get rate design correct. If a policy results in a cost shift from one group of customers to another, there better be a very good reason for adopting that policy. Not all cost shifts are necessarily bad, but utility commissioners need to know that the public is becoming more and more aware of the wedge and sledge tactics of special interest groups. If you run into a regulator or politician with an agenda for an electric generation preference, you have met someone who will end up being wrong on energy policy, and time will prove they have been an expensive public servant for consumers. So let's get rate design right. Oh, next slide. Next slide. Thanks. So let's get rate design right and be transparent in the process. If you want more information or want to have a conversation in the future, please feel free to contact me via phone or email, which is right there on that last slide. Thank you. That concludes my slide presentation.
Thanks so much, Gary. We're going to have Gary stay on the line, and for all the attendees, if you want to submit questions on either Gary or Ashley's presentation, you can do so through the webinar on your screen. And now I'm going to move on to Mr. Ashley Brown.
Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to work with Gary once again. What I want to talk about is really focus a little more specifically on the net metering and actually the broader issue about how distributed solar energy ought to be produced. But let me and almost every study that's been done is distributed solar. But the irony of what we've done over the years is we pour more money in terms of how much subsidy is there for each of these. The biggest subsidies and the biggest prices consumers pay are for the least efficient form of energy, which is distributed solar. And I want to talk a bit about why we're there and what some of the issues are. This whole issue about retail net metering, which is basically what happens is that when a customer has a solar panel, they're either consuming what they produce on their rooftop, or alternatively, they're producing less, in which case they import the difference from the system, or the other option is they're producing more than they consume and they're selling it to the system. And the question is, what's the price that you pay? What the utility pays to buy the excess generation. And we pay the full, and what most utilities do, at least in 44 states, although this is changing rapidly around the country, Gary mentioned Salt River. Wisconsin changed their policy. California is seriously looking at it, and a number of other states. So there's a proceeding in Maine, in Kansas, Oklahoma. A number of states are looking at this issue. And the quick question, the bottom line question that drives this is not only the cost shifts that Gary referenced quite well, but also the fact, why are we paying a higher price for a less efficient product? And isn't this based on historic facts that are no longer relevant? And that's how we got to net metering in the first place. The net metering is a default product of a bygone era where we had stupid meters, that is, meters that could do only three things: stand still, move forward, move backward. They couldn't measure in real time. This is critical because if you look at the price of energy in electricity, the fluctuation in any given day is enormous. At times of peak demand, the price is substantially higher than times of slack demand. But with net metering, you're paying a flat rate for generation, and this is something important to keep in mind. In almost every part of the United States, maybe every part of the United States, peak demand is generally in the later afternoon. It's not when solar hits its peak. Solar peaks in generation somewhere around noon and lasts till 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and by 4 or 5 it's largely gone. And an early evening, which in most of the United States, for every season except the summer, tends to be the time of peak demand, there is no solar. So the value of solar, actually the energy value of solar, is lower than it would otherwise appear because it's not available at times of peak demand when the price is highest. And for those of you that are concerned about environmental effect, this is important because when the price is highest, it means we're using the older plants, the more polluting plants, and solar is not offsetting that production. It's actually offsetting more efficient, less emitting plants. So there's an irony in all this, but we're paying the highest price for the type of generation that's both environmentally and economically the least efficient form of energy. But we didn't care in the old days for a couple of reasons. One is we didn't have any capability of doing anything but for going forwards, backwards, and standing still on the meter. And secondly, because there were so few solar installations, it just didn't it had no real economic impact. The cost shifts that Gary talked about were so minuscule, nobody worried about them. And to the extent to which there was policy, it said, well, look, solar's a good thing, and I think we all agree solar's a good thing. And so if you got to jumpstart the market and you pay them a little more, then you get jumpstart, and when they're commercially viable, we'll fix that problem. Next slide, please. Now, all of those things are, by the way, are no longer relevant. We now have very smart meters that can measure electricity consumption on a real-time basis, minute by minute. We have electricity prices in the grid that tell you what the price is of electricity at every hour of the day at thousands of nodes across the system. So we have very sophisticated prices, we have very sophisticated meters, and the cost of solar panels is declining dramatically. So one would expect, with all those factors, you would change the pricing arrangement. And that's what the fight's about. There are a number of people who've carved out, a number of companies that have carved out a commercial niche with flaws in the old pricing and the old pricing methodology, and they're bound and determined to continue those flaws. Now, what are some of these issues? What are the cross-subsidies or cost shifts that Gary talked about? Where are they coming from? Well, to put it in context, utilities really have, in general, 3 sets of costs. One are the absolute fixed costs, that is hard assets in the ground, and we'll look at these first off just in terms of what the wires and back office operations and whatever else is needed to actually deliver electricity. Now, you also have some fixed costs in generation. That's a little more complicated subject because in some parts of the country, the generation is not part of the utility. In some parts it is. So I won't spend too much time on that, but there could be fixed costs associated with that. But the better way of looking at those fixed costs is a third component, and that is demand costs. So we've got the fixed cost of delivery, the cost of the energy itself, that is the commodity being delivered, and third is what does it cost to build all the generating facilities? What does it cost to build all the generating facilities needed to meet peak demand? Keep in mind, utilities have, in every state in the union, an absolute legal obligation to serve all needs of customers 24/7. So the utility can't say, oops, we ran out. I mean, that happens because of unexpected outages or sometimes because demand exceeds what was reasonably anticipated. But every utility either has to invest in or contract for an enormous amount of capacity. And it does that based on what the peak demand of the system is. That's the amount of investment or contracting it has to do. And it has to pay those demand costs whether the energy is consumed or not consumed. Why is that important in solar? Because solar is an intermittent resource. It's only available when the sun is shining, which in some cases isn't predictable, but even when it is predictable, we know that 14 to 17 hours a day there's no sun. So it's not going to be there, and within that period of time is when the highest demand, when the demand is the highest, and the cost to the customer, to the utility that it passes on to the customer are the highest. So solar's value is largely tied to the energy it delivers, but the price it's paid covers all of these costs, fixed and demand costs, even though the solar resources are small-scale solar distributed do not meet either of those requirements. In short, we're asking customers to pay a retail price for a product that's essentially a wholesale one. Now, what happens if the solar host, and when I say solar host, I'm saying that because some of these hosts, people with solar rooftops, are as Gary mentioned, some of them are leasing them and some are buying them. But regardless, whenever they're consuming or producing everything they consume, they're not paying the fixed cost of the system. And the only time they pay all the fixed costs attributable to them is when they're importing from the system. So somebody has to cover those fixed costs because they don't vary with whether the solar customer is buying energy or not. They're exactly as defined. They're fixed. They're there no matter what. And so those costs, to the extent to which solar customers don't bear their fair share of the cost, they get passed on to non-solar customers. And this is interesting. Gary mentioned how for years regulators have done things to protect low-income customers, and those are subsidies that most of us agree with and think are useful. Every single study done on this question of who benefits from net metering shows it is a cross-subsidy from less affluent customers to more affluent customers. It's a kind of Robin Hood in reverse tariff. And so it not only is you're paying wholesale for a retail, you're paying retail prices for a wholesale product, you're also taking money from lower income people to provide it to more affluent people. So it's a regressive kind of, it's effectively a regressive tax. And so we're not only passing on the fixed costs, but it's also the demand costs to non-solar customers. Remember, the utility has to have all the generation it needs on call 24/7, no matter what the solar guy is doing. And since the solar guy can't tell you when he's going to produce energy because he doesn't know when the sun is shining, then you know for a fact that he does cause the system to incur demand costs, but he doesn't pay for them because he doesn't pay his full share of it, because when he's consuming what he produces, he's not paying his share of the demand costs. And so, there's very little, if any, demand cost in solar energy because the only reason you incur those costs is you want to make sure the generation is there when you need it. And no solar provider can assure you of that because he or she doesn't know. They have no way of knowing exactly when the sun is shining. And we do know that for much of the day, as I said before, when demand is at its top, the solar is generally not available. Next slide, please. Now, one of the other justifications, for the original, historically, for net metering and why we did it is it's simple. It is simple, but like a lot of simple things, it's very problematic. It was completely compatible with dumb meters that couldn't do much. Unfortunately, dumb meters are a relic of another era that are slowly disappearing all across the United States, and in some jurisdictions have disappeared entirely. It's compatible with static, non-dynamic prices, which a lot of states still have, but that's slowly changing over time. And I suspect over the long term we're going to have, when I say dynamic pricing, what I mean is the prices are going to reflect the changing cost of energy over days, over seasons, over months. And so the customer sees a real price signal. The benefit of that is it gives customers an incentive to be much more efficient. But if you use a static, non-dynamic kind of model for pricing solar energy, then the result is you don't get efficiency. And the classic example of this, the New York Times did a very interesting story about it. Gary and I have talked about this in the past, which is, why do most solar panels face south? Well, the reason is because that's how they will produce the most kilowatt hours. However, that produces them at the time that are least valuable to society because it's all off-peak. If, on the other hand, you send a dynamic price signal, meaning the price you'll pay reflects the wholesale energy price, so that when the demand is highest, the price is highest. If you did that, you'd get western exposing solar panels, which would mean they produce lower kilowatt hours, but probably produce more revenues for the solar panel. But regardless, will produce much more benefits for the system because it's going to be much closer to tracking peak demand and slack demand than they do. But so the fight over net metering is also, frankly, a fight to keep solar less efficient. There's a recent study done by just earlier this year by MIT called The Value of Solar, and they clearly point out that this kind of I forget what exactly the term they use, but this kind of subsidy that's sort of counterintuitive as net metering is, actually is an inhibition on the growth of solar energy. And in fact, Gary mentioned Solar City. There's a recent article in the trade press. Within Solar City is an affiliate company that makes batteries. And they're actually fighting it out within the company over whether they want net metering or not. Solar City wants net metering to sell panels and have the southern exposure and the business model they use. Their battery sister company does not want them because they want people to be encouraged to store energy to deliver it when it has most value. So even within the Solar City ambit of companies, there's a dispute about whether this makes any sense. And frankly, the battery component of that company makes a lot more sense in terms of what they're arguing, because ultimately they're going to deliver a more efficient product. But keep in mind also that the net metering is not the only subsidy that's provided to solar. There are tax credits. There's the investment tax credit. There's the RECs, the renewable energy credits, and in some cases the solar-specific renewable energy credits. And in the leasing arrangements, there's another tax subsidy, which goes the depreciation benefits that go to the leasing company. In fact, leases for society are far more expensive than if the homeowner buys the panel. Next slide, please. Now, let's put all this in the context, and Gary did a great job of explaining how cost-based regulation works in the United States. But there are basically three ways that we've priced energy historically. They're controversial, but they're all generally accepted. For energy, we use them, for most of the country, not all the country, we use a market basis. If there's a competitive market, the market produces the energy price. For monopoly services, we use cost-based regulation, which was what Gary was describing. There's another model that came in after 1978 called the avoided cost model, which is that the utility will buy non-utility generated energy at its own avoided costs. So it's not paying it's another way, it's an administrative way of determining kind of a proxy for a market price. These three ways, there's debates about it, but basically these three ways have been generally accepted, at least for the past 40 years, as ways of pricing. Cost-based goes back to the days of Thomas Edison. Market-based is a little more recent, but nonetheless, these are all generally accepted. Retail net metering is something from another world. It's not cost-based. It's certainly not market-based. Some people try to argue there's some kind of value basis, but to argue that it's a value basis independent of the underlying economics is an extraordinarily subjective judgment. In fact, basically, you can argue the value of solar is whatever you want it to be, because it's one of these garbage in, garbage out propositions when you run your model. And there's just simply no economic basis for retail net metering. Next slide, please. Let me skip over this one and go to slide 7. Now, the world in which net metering evolved is gone. As I said, we have smart meters, we have dynamic pricing. We are also relying, we now have developed a very, one of the things that people argued for years, and now it's really begun to hit the market, is why does electricity not have demand responses? I mean, after all, if you go to the store to buy something, you're either going to look for something that's the lowest price to meet your needs, or if it's too expensive, you may just choose you can do without it or find some kind of substitute. And so in electricity, you don't need to be using every appliance you have every day, every hour of the day. So you could choose to manage your load in ways that make it much more efficient and also environmentally sensitive. So what happens? So what we're now developing is price signals to customers to tell them. And in fact, we can now do this. It's automated through chips, through appliances that talk to the meter. You get the price signal. You run your lights in a certain way, or you run your refrigerator at certain times. Your air conditioning, you can cycle on and off. There's all kinds of things you can do depending on your comfort level and what you want to do. It's a different world than when we had net metering. So these price signals that make the whole system much more efficient are critical, and net metering is an impediment to using those effective price signals. We also have, and this is critical, a declining cost of solar panels. The cost of solar panels has declined dramatically in the past few years, very dramatically. But we're still, with net metering, using a model designed to encourage solar panels when they were first put on the market, when the price was astronomically higher to compare to what it is today. And these groups like Task are basically arguing to keep in place a subsidy as if the price were what it was 10 or 15 years ago, as opposed to what it is today. The price is declining very rapidly, and that's an important thing to note. Go on to the next slide, please. So we have a number of unintended and highly unfortunate consequences as a result of this. One is, I mentioned, this is net metering. Let's make no mistake about it. It is a tax on the poor, pure and simple. There's several studies that have been done on this. Every one of them comes to the same conclusion. It moves money from lower income people to upper income. In general, obviously there's some anomalies, but that's the trend. It also pays, again, there's not much dispute about this, the premium price for the least efficient renewable resource. If you want to look at this in terms of carbon, and certainly a lot of the solar advocates, some of them are motivated by profit, but a lot of them are motivated for good reason. They want to curb greenhouse gas emissions. That's fine. But this is not the low-cost way of doing it. We did a study in Boston, looking at some of the municipal utilities here, and actually between how much carbon reduction we get buying renewable energy credits in New England versus subsidizing solar in the community. It's distributed rooftop solar, and basically you would get 6 times more carbon reduction per dollar spent buying a renewable energy credit in New England. If you bought that credit in the Ohio Valley, which, as you know, is very coal intensive, you'd actually get 15 times the amount of carbon reduction per dollar spent. So from the standpoint, and there's not a lot of dispute, almost every study been done on this agrees that this is the least efficient source of carbon reduction. And it's questionable whether it gets carbon reduction. And we can turn to Germany, which has done us the enormous favor of having moved dramatically into intermittent resources, solar and wind both. And it's almost to the point where I think something like 30% of its capacity is wind or solar. And what has happened to carbon in Germany? Well, the answer is it's gone up. Carbon emissions have not declined. They've gone up. Now, there are a lot of reasons for it, and Germany's a bit more complicated because they're also trying to retire the nuclear plants, which, as you know, do not emit carbon. But regardless of that, the point is there are a lot of unintended consequences as a result from this. The mere fact you build solar doesn't tell you, for example, what impact it has on how we dispatch plants, whether we're dispatching dirtier, older plants, or it doesn't tell you that. And if you look in deeper, it is not at all clear that you get much carbon reduction, if any. And also the price signal it sends to the customer, and there's been some anecdotal evidence of this, and people are beginning to study it, is that it may actually drive up demand at the wrong time for a lot of complicated reasons. So it's not, you can't make a leap of logic and be correct that somehow the more solar panels on rooftops, the more we've reduced carbon. That's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of counterintuitive material here. And of course it distorts the energy signals that we've spent a lot of time in this country trying to develop. The next slide, please. So what are some of the other consequences? One is, and this is a problem for energy efficiency. Even though companies have costs that are fixed and the variable costs, and as I mentioned, demand costs, that's not how we send prices to customers. Most of the costs are variable. The more you consume, the more you pay. If you view what most economists would argue is, no, fixed costs should be recovered on a straight fixed basis. But the fixed cost of a utility, like the service charge, usually only covers some back office and billing operations. It may cover the meter, but it generally does not cover all the fixed costs. It almost never covers the fixed cost of the system. And there are a lot of policy reasons why we don't just charge a large fixed fee and then a variable price depending on energy consumption. There's really two fundamental reasons for that. One is because it does hurt the poor, and the second reason we don't do that is because the more you put into a fixed cost, then the less incentive a customer has to be efficient in their use of energy or to be conservation-minded. However, for utilities, to the extent you get more market penetration of distributed solar, which is taking away from their fixed cost recovery, they're going to move more towards a straight fixed variable, which means more emphasis on the fixed price. In other words, the price you pay no matter what you consume, and less on the variable. And the result of that is going to be very diluted and much weaker signals to get customers to pursue energy efficiency. And make no mistake about it, from a carbon reduction standpoint, energy efficiency is a lot more cost effective than distributed solar. So the question one would ask is, why would we skew the scales in favor of the less efficient resource and the one that's not even the most environmentally benign? Energy efficiency, the most benign resource is what you don't use. So energy efficiency gets you there. Now there are debates about how cost effective is energy efficiency, but that's not, I don't want to get into that. The point is, if we discourage energy efficiency to promote distributed resources, we're actually backing the wrong horse for societal benefit. We also, this is a very interesting observation that's been made by some I think, fairly astute observers. They asked the question, why are the costs of installing solar panels higher in the United States than in most of the world? And the answer they came to was net metering. Why? Because we set an arbitrarily high price, substantially higher than market, for solar panels, and the guys that's selling solar panels and installing them or developing them, I'm talking about the distributed solar, not the large-scale solar. What's happening is those guys are taking the delta between the declining cost of solar and the net metering, and they're putting it in their pocket, or they're using it to advertise to get more customers. But the point is, society's not getting the benefit of the declining cost. They're going into the pockets of some private developers. So there's sort of this David versus Goliath myth about whether utilities on one side, the Goliath, and the solar guys are David. That's not the case. Most of the solar, there are small installers, but a lot of the big solar, especially the ones Gary was talking about in Task and Tusk, are actually huge conglomerates. They're not small mom-and-pop operations. And what these guys want to do is they want to cause the price of solar installation to be higher. In other words, essentially they may suppress their own demand, and the way they get around the fact that they'd be suppressing demand is by extracting larger subsidies from everybody else. So what we're doing effectively is subsidizing inefficient solar production, and we give no incentive for productivity gains. And the battle I mentioned between the battery people in the Elon Musk empire, Elon Musk, the founder of Solar City, but he also has now got he also has the Tesla, so he's interested in battery technology. And his battery people want to have incentives for productivity, that is delivering energy when it's of optimal value to society, because they'll sell more batteries that way, and they're right. The solar people don't want that because if they got efficient, they wouldn't be able to extract these higher profits than they otherwise would by cross-subsidizing, by getting cross-subsidies from everybody, from all the non-solar customers. Also, last slide, please. Also, it distorts the price signals in the energy market. We have in the United States in the wholesale market, particularly in the organized markets, that is where we have independent system operators, the most incredibly sophisticated price signals that actually make the system far more efficient. And now we're going to carve out an exception for an inefficient generating source that's going to distort those price signals. I mean, one really has to raise a question: is do we have a policy direction where we spend literally millions and millions of dollars developing a system, and it's very efficient and very effective, and then we decide to distort it with all these distortions such as retail net metering? Secondly, as I said, it's a massive wealth transfer to solar installers with no appreciable benefit to consumers. And in this case, I include solar customers as consumers because they're not getting the benefit of the declining cost. They're going to the pocket of the solar installers. That's part of the reason why the MIT study indicated these kinds of subsidies really are not helpful to solar energy. It also promotes, as I said, the inefficient southern rather than the more beneficial western exposure of the panels, which means it reduces the value, the economic value, and it reduces the environmental value of solar. And of course, what it does ultimately is it stimulates people to make very uneconomic choices. Thanks very much, and I hope I haven't run over my time.
Thanks so much, Ashley. We just have a couple questions for you all that some of our attendees have submitted. The first one: I understand that some states have developed different mechanisms to address issues in pricing rooftop solar. For example, Minnesota created a value of solar tariff as an alternative to net metering. What do you think of this type of approach?
Yeah, Minnesota has done that. Value of solar is being used by a lot of people to try to do two things: either to get a price that's higher than retail net, or alternatively to justify net metering and claim that it's a bargain. The problem with the value of solar methodology, I mentioned this, is it's extraordinarily subjective. For example, what do you do with carbon emissions? Well, how do you value it economically? And number two, even if you do, how do you know what the real effect of solar is? Because as you've seen in Germany, it's had the opposite effect of what was intended. It may, in other circumstances, have a more beneficial effect. In hydro systems, it may be more beneficial, for example. So it's a highly subjective. The real telling thing about the Minnesota thing is that Minnesota didn't adopt it. It simply enabled utilities to use it if they chose to do so, and nobody's put it into play. Nobody's using it. So I'm leery of value of solar studies, because frankly, if I could see who wrote it, I could tell you their conclusion. And it's either going to have a highly inflated value or it could even be a highly deflated value, because it's entirely dependent on what assumptions you want to throw in. So I don't put a lot of value in that. And then the ultimate test is that Minnesota doesn't use it. They only enable it, and nobody's chosen to use it.
Gary, did you have anything to add on that?
Not on that. That was well done, Ash.
Okay, great. The next one is: do you believe that subscription-based utility-scale solar utilizes monopoly power to encroach on the competitive market of rooftop solar?
Well, that's I'll jump in there.
Okay.
I think I listened to that question and I appreciate it, but the reality is, I think it's what's important. What is best for consumers? What is best for the customers of the utility? Utilities have an obligation to provide service, and if you listen to all of what Ashley said and what I've said too, utility scale solar, it really can't be compared with rooftop solar economically. It just can't. Rooftop solar is much more expensive. Utility scale solar will We have a lot of that in Arizona, but it's on a tracking system. It follows east to west all throughout the day, and so we get a great deal of production out of utility scale solar. So really, when it comes to what is more intermittent, the rooftop solar is much more intermittent. So it really boils down to that. What is going to help a utility manage their resources? If you're going to have solar, it's obvious. Utility scale solar is going to be what is best for a utility to manage their resources. And we have merchants who have utility scale solar as well, not just that the utilities buy power from. Here in Arizona, we have quite a few of those, and a lot of those merchants are selling that solar power into California and other areas to utilities there. So we have both. It's not the utility. We push the utility in Arizona to compete on all their resources, and so we have merchants, we have the utility, but the rooftop is not competitive with utility scale, not at all.
If I could add something.
Sure.
The two things. One is just what Gary said about utility. Utility scale means the size, not utility owned. We're talking about large scale versus small scale. Some people think when you use the term utility scale, you mean utility owned. It doesn't mean that. It could mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. But I love this question about monopoly power. This is the ultimate irony, because yes, to some extent, there is a monopoly power. And what the groups like Task and Tusk really want to do is they want to use the monopoly power of a utility to extract the most profits for themselves. It's not that they're against market power. In fact, they want to use the market power. That's why the question I mentioned earlier, the issue I mentioned earlier, that solar actually, the installation costs of solar in the U.S. are the highest, and the reason is because by using net metering, we're allowing the world of competition only to include a small subset of solar developers who are not in a market where they're competing with each other, but in a market where basically they've got absolute monopoly power to extract a lot of rents that are above market. I personally believe the way to price solar is a market price. We know what the market price is. In most parts of the country, we know what it is every hour of the day, every location of the system, and that's what they ought to be paid. But when you suggest that to the solar people, they don't want anything that looks even remotely like market prices. They don't want competitively driven prices. What they want is they want to take advantage of whatever monopoly power a utility may have and use that to extract monopoly rents from their customers. So this is really not about competition versus monopoly. And frankly, if you want to compete, the benefit of competition is you get more efficient, you promote efficiency, you send off price signals that promote efficiency, and everything about net metering does the opposite of that. It's hard to imagine a more anti-competitive practice than net metering. So when solar companies argue they're competing against these giant monopolies, that's nonsense. What they want to do is take some of the monopoly power and keep it for their own benefit.
Okay, thanks. Here's one more question. A 2015 report from Environment America reviewed 11 recent analyses about solar contributions in net metering and found that, quote, 8 analyses out of 11 found that the value of solar energy was worth more than the average residential retail electricity rate in the area at the time the analysis was conducted. Is that correct? Are these analyses using the wrong metrics?
Well, two things about that. One is that, first off, there are far more than 11 studies. And I'm not sure, I mean, I've seen a study that was done in Maine, actually. I'm not sure it's the same one the question is referring to. But it makes essentially the same argument. It's first off, they cherry pick what studies to pick. Then instead of taking the universe of studies. Secondly, it gets to the issue we talked about already, which is it's all based on somebody's subjective judgments about the value of solar. And it's not just a subjective judgment about the value. There's lots of different criteria you have to look at, and you make a lot of subjective judgments. As I said, if I were, which I'm not, if I were anti-solar, I could do a value of solar study that shows the value is far less than than in fact it probably is. And similarly, if I were a big advocate for if I wanted to sell solar, I could come up with the opposite conclusion. So I just generally am pretty cynical about these value of solar studies because they're entirely dependent on whatever input you want to provide. and all of us, frankly, all human beings, put in the inputs that sort of comport with our bias. So I wouldn't put much stock in those. And frankly, if you're going to do a compendium of studies, then take the universe of studies, not 11 that you cherry pick.
And one thing, when you value an electron, you have to ask yourself, is an electron more valuable if it's available 24/7, or is it less valuable if it's not? And obviously solar is only available at certain times. The other thing is solar intermittent power has to be backed up. We require utilities to make sure they can provide service 24/7, whether that solar is available or not. Whether it's a middle of the day when they normally produce, but a cloud cover comes over, we want the utilities to be backing this up, and so they don't miss a beat when it comes to providing electrons to any household or business. So therefore, what is more valuable, an intermittent source or a source that provides 24/7? That's the question you have to ask yourself.
All right, we have time for one more question. This question says, what is the value of capping the number of solar users in a utility's distribution area, such as capping the number of net metering users to 0.5%?
Yeah, that's a battle that's going on in a lot of states. And actually, it's the derivation of that is interesting. When net metering was adopted in a number of states, a lot of the legislators were well aware that they may be doing something, they're venturing into territory they didn't understand, and there were going to be adverse consequences. And the way they protected themselves is by putting a cap on, saying this is the most. Well, there were two kinds of caps. One is a cap on the total production because it limited the size of the cross-subsidy that they feared could occur. The other had to do with some technical issues about what would impose more costs on the distribution system to manage bidirectional flows and a lot of engineering questions. So there were two different kinds of caps. Most of the debate about caps, though, goes to the first one, not the second one. But the irony of it is, as a colleague of mine said, what the legislature did with adopting caps, that is putting a cap on the absolute limit of how many net metering facilities we would allow, one legislator was quoted by, a colleague was telling me, one legislator was quoted saying, we're about to do something really, really stupid, so please stop me before I do too much of it. That's where the caps came from. It was experimental. Some of the people that pushed for it said, well, look, what we want to do is we want to have a subsidy to push distributed solar over the top. By over the top, I mean give it a goose start, so we can actually become competitive. But and that's how, if you really want to promote commercialization of a technology that's desirable, and solar is certainly desirable, then you give it a short-term boost through some kind of subsidy to get it over the top. But then it's got to be on its own. What some of the solar advocates are arguing for now is not that. They're arguing for a subsidy in perpetuity, despite the fact they've become competitive. And whether they've become competitive is not even a matter of debate. Elon Musk, who's the founder of Solar City, gave a speech at Edison Electric a couple months ago, in which he said, look, once we price carbon, and carbon is priced in a number of states around the country, and if the EPA rules that have been proposed or something similar to it goes into effect, carbon will be priced throughout the United States. He said once carbon is priced, there is no reason to have a subsidy for solar. And it's pretty simple. I mean, so those caps were designed to just do either, to the extent to which it was policy, it was give it a short-term boost, and the cap defines the short term, or alternatively, gee, we don't know how this is going to turn out, so let's limit our liabilities here. And now, as I say, a number of the solar advocates, a battle in the Massachusetts legislature right now, want to lift the cap. The point is, why would you lift the cap when solar's become commercially viable?
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I just want to thank all the attendees, everybody who asked questions, and thank you so much to our presenters, Mr. Ashley Brown and Mr. Gary Pierce. We will be posting this webinar in CSG's Knowledge Center. So if you want to go back and review it, you can head over to the Knowledge Center and do that. And thank you all so much.